I titled this lecture, Vernacular Canon, or Why Does Snow White Cuss So Much? Boo fucking who? I'll try to live with the loss. When did you start cussing so much? In this lecture, I discuss some work by Neil Gaiman and Bill Willingham. Of the authors we have covered, Gaiman and Willingham are perhaps closest to literature and furthest from it. I say closest because they are both novelists who create comics with separate illustrators, and because their work is deeply intertwined with pre-existing stories. I also say furthest because their genre is fantasy, a genre relegated to the non-literary, to children's and fan fiction. Both Gaiman and Willingham essentially write stories about stories, and the very process of storytelling. Knowing stories, recognizing the fictional world, inhabiting it, and imagining it is a component of the fantasy genre itself. And thus I would suggest that fantasy teaches us something about the intimacy of storytelling and of story knowing, about the power of stories in our own lives, and about our ability to participate in the canon. Neil Gaiman was born in 1960 in Portchester, England. Through a friendship with Alan Moore, he picked up the writing on Marvel Man after Moore moved on, and soon began writing a number of comics. In 1987, he wrote Violent Cases, which Dave McKean illustrated, and in 1988, they teamed to produce Black Orchid for DC Comics. From there, Gaiman wrote the Sandman series, among many, many other comics. He's also the author of a number of novels, including the 1990 Good Omens with Terry Pratchett, the 1999 Stardust, the 2001 American Gods, the 2005 Anansi Boys. He has written young adult and children's books, such as the 2002 Coraline, which won the Hugo, Nebula, and Bram Stoker Awards, and the Graveyard Book in 2008, which won the Newbery and Carnegie Medals, the first time both have been awarded to a single book. The Sandman series ran for 75 issues from January 1989 to March 1996. Originally proposed to DC as a continuation of the Sandman superhero by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, Karen Berger, a DC editor, took the proposal as an original series, and Gaiman, along with Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg, created the series with Dave McKean doing the covers. The Sandman begins with the figure of Dream the Endless, here facing off with the original Kirby Sandman, and drawn by Dringenberg to look not a little like Gaiman himself. Dream goes by various names: the Shaper, Morpheus Oneros. Freed from 75 years of imprisonment, he returns to take back his kingdom. Throughout, the Sandman features separate story arcs and individual stories, some focusing exclusively on Dream and others freestanding. It ends with a final issue in which Dream inspires William Shakespeare to write The Tempest. The series won 26 Eisner Awards, and Gaiman is currently writing a prequel. Bill Willingham was born in Virginia in 1956. He started working in the 1980s illustrating rule books for Dungeons & Dragons, the role-playing game. From there, he began writing the Elementals series for the company Comico, as well as for the Sandman Presents. Willingham has gone on to write the prose novel Peter and Max, a Fables novel. Fables began in 2002, penciled by Lan Medina and inked by Steve Lihola and Craig Hamilton. Its covers are illustrated by James Jean. It has won no less than 13 Eisner Awards, and one story, War and Pieces, was nominated for the Hugo Award. Both Sandman and Fables chronicle sweeping stories and have multiple related series, including The Sandman Presents and Willingham's 1001 Nights of Snowfall, Jack of Fables, and Fairest. It is impossible to treat their whole expanses, and so I'm going to apply Cuskin Rule number 1 and circle in on two stories: the first trade paperback of Fables, Legends in Exile, and one issue of The Sandman, issue number 19 from 1990. I will then apply Cuskin Rule number 2 and synthesize some conclusions from these two texts. Both comics are published by the DC imprint Vertigo. Vertigo was founded by Karen Berger in 1993 and quickly folded the pre-existing Sandman series into it. Karen Berger has only recently been succeeded in the position of editor by Shelley Bond. But Berger, an English major, shaped Vertigo as a line intended to foster sophisticated storytelling. As such, Vertigo was very much a reaction to the 1986 trifecta, a sense that comics could and should develop, and was inspired by the first wave of British writers in America, Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. In the early 90s, Vertigo brought a second invasion of British writers to DC, including Gaiman, Peter Milligan, and Garth Ennis. And this is my thesis. If Vertigo helped comics grow up across the 1990s, the power of comics is to help literature grow down a bit. Fables and Sandman are both fantasy fiction, literature that is not high art, but is nevertheless tremendously popular, vulgar in the sense of the common people. I suggest that all new literary formats emerge from a position of entertainment and thus seize established authority from the Academy. This grab involves some upset, and it is marked by a breach in decorum. Hence Snow White's foul mouth. The power of comics is to recover the vulgarity of literature. From the start, Fables is about its genre. Fables are short stories, often involving the personification of animals towards a moral in a world of fantasy fiction. They share much with fairy tales, which are stories of enchantment, of magic that is claimed true within a secondary world separate from our own, and that resolves in a eucatastrophe, the feeling of well-being encapsulated in the phrase, happily ever after. J.R.R. Tolkien, in his essay on fairy tales, defines fables and fairy tales as part of fantasy fiction, as the making or glimpsing of other worlds. And that is what Fables does. It creates a coherent other world, embedded within our world. The action of Fables is a murder mystery set in New York City. All of the characters are recognizable. Snow White, the big bad wolf, the three little pigs, Prince Charming, Beauty and the Beast, and so forth. And they live in exile from their homeland. They have gone into hiding and now live in an anonymous apartment building. The two main characters of Fables, at least at this early stage of the story, are Snow White, who manages the building in which the Fables live, and Bigby, who is the big bad wolf in disguise. Both swear quite a lot. In the first issue, Jack, from Jack and the Beanstalk, reveals to Bigby that Snow White's sister, Rose Red, has been killed, and so Jack, Snow, and Bigby walk in on a scene of horror, an apartment drenched in blood. Rose's furniture and possessions are slashed and ransacked. Scrawled on the wall is the antithesis of the fairy story moral. No more happily ever after. It announces a discatastrophe, a sense of overwhelming unease, exactly the opposite from the promise of the fairy tale story. The plot twists and turns until in Chapter 4, Bigby finally assembles the main characters poolside on the roof of the apartment complex on the night of the enormous Fables Ball, the annual celebration of their flight from their homeworld at the hands of the adversary who drove them into exile. That night, incidentally, Jack has won the lottery. Isn't that a kick in the nads? All my life I've been trying one crazy scheme after another to make it big, and all I had to do was buy a ticket. Too bad it's all worthless. True, we can dream about the day when we'll kick the adversary's ass out of our old lands, including my new old lands now. But anyone who's not a romantic fool knows it's never going to happen. Ready to begin your show? It looks like the rubes have arrived. Just remember to do your part on cue, Your Highness. This is it. In the mystery novels, this is called the parlor scene, where the clever detective reveals all. If this were a work of fiction, the author would pause the story here to ask the readers if they put all the clues together yet. Oh, do get on with it, young man. Sorry, sir, but in our secret hearts, every real cop longs for a moment like this, and damn few get one. Indulge me, please. Here, Bigby promises the revelation, the denouement or unknotting of the entire murder mystery. The scene returns us to Raymond Chandler's discussion of the difference between mystery and the hard-boiled story. Bigby even comments on its generic quality, announcing, "This is it. In the mystery novel, this is called the parlor scene, where the clever detective reveals it all." In fact, the gathered crowd are bored with Bigby's performance. "Oh, do get on with it, young man." So Fables proves Chandler entirely correct. The mystery is exhausted, and if anything, this page is one of exhaustion, one making use of a basic grid and of a plot assembled from stock characters married to tough guy lines. From the start, there is little tension in the mystery overall, and in fact, it's fairly clear that Rose Red was never killed. The excitement of Fables does not come from any revelation of the plot, but as Chandler says, from its individual scenes. What is the scene of Fables? I would suggest it is the scene of recognition. Here the Fables flee from the adversary's attack. The thrill of the scene is that of recognition, and the page is an invitation for us to tarry, to pick out the separate characters from Grimm's Tales, from Aesop's Fables, from The Wizard of Oz, to spot the seven dwarves, Baba Yaga, Tinker Bell, and the Huntsman, and to recognize all the other worlds from our own memories as readers of, or listeners to, these stories. In his study, Children's Literature, A Reader's History, Seth Lair writes that the nature of the fable genre is connected to our identity as readers. He writes, "Our word vernacular comes from the Latin verna, a female household servant, and we might well say that the history of the fable is the history of the vernacular. Fables rely on figurative language. They take parts for wholes, draw on particulars for generalizations, make mute creatures speak. Their status in the nursery or in the classroom rests not simply on their moral or didactic goals, but on their metaphorical enchantment. They are, quite simply, literature at its most simple and direct, and instruction in the fable is a lesson in the arts of the literary imagination." For Lair, the genre of fables works through metaphorical enchantment. It creates an analogy between the space of reading and the figural space in which animals can talk, in which our earliest encounter with the other world of fiction produces a sense of well-being. Lair points out that fables are connected to the vernacular. The vernacular is the language of the people, as opposed to that of the Latin church or academy. It comes from the Latin word for female household servant, and thus it suggests a language of subjection. Snow White curses because she is part of this vernacular. In Fables, hers is a story of dispossession and of subjection. She has been exiled from her world and is stuck in a reality in which her stories are debased, second-rate. Thus her curse is a point of identification as well as of invitation. It is her invitation to identify with her predicament and then to participate in the plotline of Fables, to embody it, to fill out its contours, and to construct it as a thriving other world. Without our imaginative participation, Fables has no energy. It is just Bigby in a terry cloth towel reciting some tired old lines that were exhausted by the 1930s. With our participation, it is a vernacular canon, an imaginary totality that we know and authorize from reading we have long forgotten but still resides in our literary imagination. Fable's scene asks for our participation in its storytelling, and so figures fantasy as a reader's vernacular canon. Neil Gaiman's Sandman accomplishes a similar effect in a different register. In Sandman 19, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Dream the Endless visits William Shakespeare's acting company. The title page splash shows us the fairies emerging from a hill of green. The top 3 panels depict a figure in the green hillside. The figure becomes animated and traces out and then opens up a portal, a door, which seems to allow the procession of fairy characters of Shakespeare's play to emerge, all under the watchful eye of Morpheus in Elizabethan garb. Visually, Charles Vess's pages work through layering, putting one action upon the next. This is how Gaiman's story works as well, and we can appreciate Gaiman's layering here, where Morpheus, Shakespeare, and Richard Burbage talk on the hillside. Will, what is happening? Who is this man? This is the gentleman I told you of, Richard. It was he who commissioned the new play. Ah, I am Richard Burbage, the leading man of Lord Strange's men, and head of our company. And you are? I am your patron for this play. You must act well tonight, Richard Burbage. Sir, I never give a performance that is less than my best. All this barbarous farrago of fairy tale hodgepodge is a mere crowd pleaser at best. Tragedy is my forte. I have told Will to make me a lover most tragical, and when we return to London, I will make them weep true tears. I have no doubts of your ability, Master Burbage. I see, you understand the theatre, monsieur. Lead us to your hall, then, and we shall perform our comedy for your enjoyment. I have no hall, not that I will take you to. But here, Burbage, on the downs of Sussex, this will be your stage. We will play on the green sward, Richard, just as we have rehearsed it in the fields and glades. This is a natural stage, and the evening is warm, and the light will last us. I owe much to this man. Bestir yourselves there, lumpkins, and into your costumes. We perform the play here, on the screen, within the hour. On one layer, the play enacts history by giving us a bird's-eye view of Shakespeare's acting troupe, the Lord Strange's men who actually did tour the English countryside in 1593, making their way along in carts and wagons. Richard Burbage, who Gaiman casts here as the head of the company, was Shakespeare's great tragic actor, playing lead in Hamlet, Othello, Richard II, and King Lear. On a second layer, the page is deeply engaged with the authority of literature. In Tier 1, Panel 3, Burbage actually dismisses fantasy fiction entirely, labeling Midsummer Night's Dream a fairy tale hodgepodge, a mere crowd pleaser at best. Burbage has no time for the crowd. He prefers tragedy. On another layer still, the page asks about the value of storytelling. In the final tier, in panels more dense than those above, Shakespeare confesses that he owes Dream some debt. Burbage concedes, and so the play commences, players donning costumes as king and queen, rude mechanicals, and would-be lovers, and the fairy host, Oberon, Titania, Robin Goodfellow, Pease Blossom, and the rest, find themselves within the play. In this regard, A Midsummer Night's Dream is exactly like fables. Gaiman has upped the stakes so that instead of the fables of childhood, we're invited to recognize and to participate in the work of the most canonical English writer of all time. He recalls, then, that Midsummer Night's Dream is a fantasy, and that it was created not by a god, but by a person, and he asks us to participate in it, to recognize the play as the fairies recognize themselves, and to consider the debt this human Shakespeare owes the god of dreams. In fact, to identify with Shakespeare as we consider this debt. So we listen in on a conversation between Morpheus and Titania. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of man to say what wit it was. Man is but an ass. If he go about to expound this dream, methought I was, there is no man can tell what. I wonder, Titania, I wonder if I have done right. And I wonder why I wonder. Will is a willing vehicle for the great stories. Through him, they will live for an age of man, and his words will echo down through time. It is what he wanted. But he did not understand the price. Mortals never do. They only see the prize, their heart's desire, their dream. But the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. And had I told him, had he understood, what then? It would have made no difference. Have I done right, Titania? Have I done right? Oh, it is a wonderful play, Lord Shaper, most enchanting and fine. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. Again, we are given a layered story. The top and bottom tiers are occupied by two long panels and show young Will Kemp, the comedian of the troupe, playing Nick Bottom, the rude mechanical who is given the head of an ass in the play. Freed from the ass's head, Bottom remains a fool, and he interprets his experience in fairyland as a dream, which he has not the heart to report. These two tiers create the backdrop, the wallpaper, if you will, for the conversation. On the one hand, the tiers give us a temporal frame. Because the conversation is layered over the top and bottom tiers, we can imagine that the events are simultaneous. Titania and Dream talk while the play is going on. On the other hand, Bottom, whether in human or transformed form, is an ass. Dream wonders if he has done right, if the price of being a vehicle for great stories was too much. Bluntly, the bargain he made with William Shakespeare is a bargain for greatness, precisely for not being a fool, an ass on a historical scale, but instead being as close to immortal as mortals can get. The initial bargain that Shakespeare and Dream struck was for two plays. This play, Midsummer Night's Dream, acted on the Sussex Downs, and the last play, The Tempest, featured in the very last comic of the Sandman series. Certainly, two plays do not seem too high a price, especially when they constitute part of the greatness for which Shakespeare bargained in the first place. But Dream implies here that a higher price is to be paid, a loss that Shakespeare does not foresee. Titania only remarks that the play is enchanting and fine. What is this price? A few pages before the conversation, Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, complains, "Mother ordered him to have me for the summer. It's the first time I've seen him for more than a week at a time that I remember." And soon after that, we spy Titania tempting young Hamnet with an apple, and further seducing him with talk of bonny dragons that will come when you do call them and fly you through the honeyed amber skies. There is no night in my land, pretty boy, and it is forever summer's twilight. Midsummer Night's Dream is dated between 1594 and 1596. Gaiman imagines this performance as June 23rd, 1593, and notes that Hamnet died in 1596. So Tolkien says, "Fairy is a perilous land. In it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold." And thus Gaiman seems to suggest that one of the costs of laboring in this perilous land is not to know your own son more than a week at a time, and so not to have recourse to memories of him when he is gone. As Shakespeare, the canonical author, we tend not to identify him, to forget that he made choices and had to live by them. By the same token, we tend to view his writing as insulated by its own greatness, far from our imaginative play, the stuff of literature, not of fantasy. Gaiman asks us to participate in the creation of another world, a world of fairy and of literature, and in doing so asks us to imagine what the stakes of authorship are, the human stakes, and what they were for Shakespeare himself. I would like to close then on Titania's final lines. "It is a wonderful play, Lord Shaper, most enchanting and fine." Titania delivers these as an aside, but they stand as confirmation that Dream did indeed do right, and that, by implication, Shakespeare bargained well. It is well worth losing your son to the labor of storytelling, if the fruit of the labor might be most enchanting and fine. But what is the value of an enchanting and fine story? I turn to Gaiman's 2005 novel, Anansi Boys. Anansi is a West African god who takes the shape of a spider, and who is a trickster and a storyteller. In the novel, he dies and meets up with a woman, Maeve Livingston, who was murdered earlier. He tells her the story of how, many years ago, Anansi, he doesn't reveal that he himself is Anansi, earned all the stories of the world from Tiger. Let me read. "It's just a folk story," she said. "People made up stories in the first place." "Does that change things?" asked the old man. "Maybe Anansi's just some guy from a story, made up back in Africa in the dawn days of the world by some boy with a black fly on his leg, pushing his crutch in the dirt, making up some goofy story about a man made of tar. Does that change anything? People respond to stories. They tell themselves. The stories spread and people tell them. The stories change the tellers, because now the folk who never had any thought in their head but how to run from lions and keep far enough away from the rivers that crocodiles don't get an easy meal, now they're starting to dream about a whole new place to live. The world may be the same, but the wallpaper's changed, yes? People still have the same story, the one where they get born and they do stuff and they die. But now the story means something different to what it meant before. You're telling me that before the Anansi stories, the world was savage and bad? Yeah, pretty much. She digested this. Well, she said cheerily, it's certainly a good thing that the stories are now Anansi's. The old man nodded. The world may be the same, but the wallpaper's changed. Stories provide the context for life. Anansi is a spider, and through his stories he weaves a web. The word text, which suggests story, actually comes from the same root as textile. Stories are weavings. They weave together literal truths, figural truths, and they bind them together in the material substance of our lives. Stories have this power. They set the context for living. If we lose our purchase on stories, on interpreting them and knowing them, our context changes, and we live in a kind of poverty of the imagination. Literature is both a term of authority and of appeal. As a term of authority, literature with a capital L, the stories it tells can be divorced from our everyday reality, and we are left with a world with nothing but fear. Fear of those lions and crocodiles that Anansi mentions. As a term of appeal, literature is simply storytelling. Thus, I say comics return literature to its vulgarity. They return literature to a vernacular canon. By this I mean the category of literature tends to isolate storytelling, to shut it off, as if literature does not bear stories but only bears authority. But all literature comes first from its popular appeal. In the comics form a vernacular canon, indeed a canon vulgar with economics and with popularity, a canon that knows not the authority of refined greatness, they remind us that we participate in storytelling to our own strength. Literature is for everyone. It is a human right.